Someone walks into a meeting and says, "Good news! The AI system has zero data retention." Security hears, "The provider is not keeping the prompts." Privacy hears, "Less external persistence." Procurement hears, "Put that phrase in the control matrix." Engineering hears, "Excellent. Can we ship Friday?" Then one irritatingly useful operator asks a few questions. Which endpoint? Which project? Which tools? Does our gateway log the request body? Does the observability platform keep the trace? Where does the output go? What happens when an external tool receives the context? And what, exactly, does zero exclude? That is when the room discovers that zero applied to one layer of the system, not the whole system. That does not make the promise false. It makes the architecture unfinished. Zero is doing a lot of unpaid labor in that sentence. This week, OpenAI announced a new approach designed to preserve zero data retention while detecting risky patterns across related interactions. That is a real technical and operational signal. It is also a reminder that retention, safety monitoring, application state, third-party tools, and your own logs are different things. Zero data retention is not zero data flow. And if an organization cannot map the flow, it cannot prove the zero. By the end of this episode, you will have a 6-part retention boundary receipt and one 45-minute test you can run before a privacy promise turns into architecture by adjective. Welcome back to AI Change Desk. I am Michael. This is episode 42. Where does zero retention end? Quick disclosure before we start. AI-assisted tools were used in parts of the research and production workflow. Final editorial judgment, risk posture, and release approval stayed human-led. This is operational guidance, not legal advice. These are my opinions and are not representative of any organization. One additional disclosure as the desk evolves. My current role includes privacy work, so you will hear me pay closer attention to purpose, access, retention, deletion, and accountability. I will not discuss non-public work here. These are my personal views, and they do not represent the state of Oregon or any other organization. This is AI Change Desk. Thank you for choosing to tune in. Before we get into the signal, a quick programming note. This episode is arriving a day later than planned because the Hawk fire affecting the Verdi and Northwest Reno area required my attention. My thoughts are with everyone affected, and with the firefighters, emergency crews, volunteers, and neighbors supporting the response. The episode was source-checked again today, August 25th, 2026. Thank you for the patience. Now, back to the work. Last week, episode 41 asked a simple privacy question. What did the AI see? This week is the next question in that chain. What stayed? Where did it stay? And who can prove the answer? That continuity matters. Collection and retention are not the same control. A system can collect context briefly and retain almost nothing at the provider. It can also retain nothing at the provider while your own application keeps copies everywhere. Both statements can be true. The operating model has to hold both truths at once. As I have disclosed since returning to the show, my day job now puts me closer to privacy work. That sharpens the questions I ask here. It does not make this podcast a statement of State of Oregon policy, and I will not discuss non-public work. The point is simpler. Privacy gets practical very quickly when somebody has to draw the actual path. Start with what OpenAI announced. On August 19th, OpenAI published a preview of what it calls Private Safety Processing. The company says zero data retention gives eligible API customers a specific promise. OpenAI does not retain their prompts or model responses after the request is processed. It says customer content is not available to OpenAI personnel for review, and enterprise customer data is not used for training unless the customer explicitly opts in. Those are material commitments. They should be read precisely. Eligible API customers. Prompts and model responses. After a request is processed, and an explicit opt-in boundary for training. The new part is the safety design. OpenAI says some risks become visible only across multiple related interactions. One request may look ordinary. A sequence may show repeated probing, coordination across accounts, or an agent continuing after it was told to stop. Existing zero data retention compatible systems, according to OpenAI, evaluate interactions individually. Private safety processing is designed to identify patterns across related interactions without giving OpenAI personnel access to the underlying prompts and responses. OpenAI describes two storage paths. For zero data retention deployments, it says customer content remains on infrastructure the customer controls. It also says it is developing an option where content would be stored on OpenAI infrastructure, encrypted with customer-controlled keys. The company says automated systems could return a limited safety signal without exposing the underlying content to OpenAI personnel. If a customer wants to appeal or support an investigation, the customer can choose to share relevant information. That is the announcement. It is a preview. OpenAI says it is being tested with early customers. It is not a reason to describe every current deployment as using private safety processing. OpenAI says it plans a technical white paper and a rollout beginning in September. Until those details arrive, operators should preserve the words preview, designed, testing, and planned. Future tense is not a control status. It is a calendar wearing a blazer. There is also an exception worth saying plainly. OpenAI's announcement says images flagged as potential child sexual abuse material continue to be retained for manual review and reporting, including in zero data retention deployments. That is not a footnote to hide. It is part of the boundary. The phrase zero does not remove stated legal and safety exceptions. Now move from the announcement to the platform documentation. OpenAI's data control documentation says zero data retention is available to eligible customers, subject to prior approval and additional requirements. Approved organizations can configure the control at the organization or project level. For the responses and chat completions APIs, the store setting is treated as false when zero data retention is enabled. That is useful. It is still not the end of the map. The same documentation distinguishes abuse monitoring logs from application state. That distinction is easy to miss because both can sound like retention. Abuse monitoring logs help a provider enforce usage policy. Application state exists because some features need persistence to work. Zero data retention changes some behavior, but feature compatibility still matters. OpenAI's current documentation says, for example, that background mode is not compatible with zero data retention. Extended prompt caching is not eligible. Code interpreter cannot be used when zero data retention is enabled. The video endpoint is not compatible with data retention controls. And remote MCP servers are third-party services, so data sent to them follows their retention policies. There are more endpoint details than that. The important point is not to memorize the table. The important point is to stop treating an organization-level label as proof for every project, endpoint, model, tool, and request path. Eligibility is not enablement. Enablement is not compatibility. Compatibility is not end-to-end proof. This is where organizations get into trouble. They ask a vendor question and write down a system answer. Does the provider retain our prompt? That is a vendor question. Does any component in our workflow retain the data? That is a system question. The first answer may be zero. The second answer almost never fits inside one adjective. There are at least 4 different zeros hiding inside the conversation. The first is provider content retention. Does the model provider retain the prompt and response after processing? That is the zero OpenAI's announcement addresses most directly. It is important. It is not interchangeable with the other three. The second is feature state. Does the endpoint or tool need temporary or persistent state to function? A conversation object, a file, a vector store, a background job, a cache, or a generated artifact may have a separate lifecycle. If the feature requires state, the team has to understand that state instead of repeating the organization level label. The third is operational telemetry. What metadata, classifier output, request identifier, latency measure, billing record, security event, or limited safety signal exists? Some of that information may not contain the prompt or response. It can still matter for access, purpose, retention, and accountability. Content minimization does not make system data imaginary. The fourth is customer-side retention. What did your organization keep before the request, during the request, and after the answer returned? This includes the source object, the application log, the user visible history, the output record, the audit trail, the backup, and the copy somebody pasted into chat. 1 0 can be true, while the other three are not zero at all. That is why the approval language needs levels. Level 1 is a vendor statement. The provider describes a capability or commitment, useful evidence, not environment proof. Level 2 is a contractual entitlement. The organization is eligible and the relevant terms apply. Stronger, still not effective configuration. Level 3 is configured state. The correct organization and project show the intended data control. Better, still not the complete workflow. Level 4 is runtime evidence. A synthetic test shows which endpoints accepted the request, which tools ran, which logs were created, which artifacts remained, and which deletion or expiration behavior occurred. Level 5 is repeatable assurance. The evidence is checked again after a model change, endpoint change, tool change, gateway change, or contract change. Because nothing says mature governance like validating a control once and then placing it gently in a museum. An organization should never jump from level 1 to level 5 because the adjective is comforting. The missing levels are the work. The language people receive should reflect that work. Avoid saying, "Nothing is stored." That sentence is usually too broad to survive contact with the architecture. Avoid saying, "The model forgets everything." That turns a configured data control boundary into a claim about model behavior. Avoid saying, "The workflow is private," because the provider offers zero data retention. Private is not a technical setting. It is a conclusion that depends on purpose, access, processing, sharing, retention, security, and the people affected. Use bounded language instead. For this named API project, zero data retention is enabled for these eligible request paths. The provider states that prompts and responses are not retained after processing, subject to its documented exceptions. Our application still creates these named logs and output records, which follow these schedules. These external tools are outside the provider's retention commitment. This configuration was last verified on this date by this owner. That language is longer. Good. The system is longer than the slogan. If a privacy claim fits comfortably on a coffee mug, check whether the exceptions are printed on the bottom. The user notice does not need the entire endpoint matrix. It does need the truth at the right level. What information is used? For what purpose? What parts of the workflow retain it? Who can access the resulting record? How long does that record remain? What choice or recourse exists? Where can the person get a fuller explanation? Simplicity is useful. False simplicity is a liability. And every statement needs a review trigger. A new endpoint can change the state model. A new connector can add a third party. A new debugging flag can capture content. A new retention feature can create an artifact. A new safety design can change which signals exist across interactions. A new contract term can change the commitment. The approval should therefore name the events that force revalidation. Otherwise, today's accurate sentence becomes next quarter's inherited fiction. Imagine a fictional contract review assistant. An employee uploads a draft agreement. The application sends it through an internal gateway to an approved API project with zero data retention enabled. The model drafts a risk summary. The summary appears in a ticket. On paper, the provider did not retain the prompt or response. Good. Now draw the rest. The browser may keep a local history. The upload service may create a temporary object. The gateway may log request metadata. A poorly configured logger may capture part of the body. The tracing platform may preserve inputs and outputs for debugging. The ticketing system may retain the summary under its own schedule. An external tool may receive context under a different policy. Backups may preserve objects after the primary copy is deleted. The employee may download the result and email it to 6 people, including the one person who replies all with, adding, legal for visibility. The provider statement can remain completely true. The system can still leave a wide retention trail. That is not a gotcha. It is why privacy architecture cannot stop at the model boundary. And this is not a job for one department to solve alone. Product owns the business purpose and the user experience. Engineering owns the implemented path and the feature choices. Security owns access, monitoring, and incident response controls. Privacy owns the privacy risk questions, not every technical fact in the diagram. Records and legal teams may need to assess retention duties, holds, disposition, and applicable requirements. Procurement owns the evidence that came through the agreement and the vendor review process. The business owner decides whether the residual uncertainty is acceptable for the use. If all of those roles point at privacy, privacy does not become the owner of the reverse proxy. If they all point at engineering, engineering does not become legal counsel with a deployment pipeline. And if they all point at the vendor does not become your record schedule, your user notice, or your risk decision. Shared work still needs named ownership. Otherwise, the math becomes a group project where every arrow was drawn by someone who thought another person was labeling the boxes. This is also where safety monitoring and privacy can be framed badly. The lazy version says, privacy wants no visibility, and safety wants all the data. That is not a useful operating question. The useful question is, what signal is necessary? What content is exposed? Who can access it? Where it is processed? How long it exists? What exception applies? And what evidence proves the design? Privacy and safety are not opposing slogans. They are design requirements that need an accountable boundary. NIST's privacy framework is useful here. It is voluntary. It is not law. Its value is the operating discipline. NIST describes privacy risk management across a data processing ecosystem, including organizations, service providers, developers, and other connected entities. It emphasizes identifying processing, governing responsibilities, controlling data, communicating practices, protecting information, and reassessing outcomes over the life cycle. That is the right level of skepticism, not cynical, not impressed by adjectives, interested in the full path. Here is the 6-part retention boundary receipt. First, the scope receipt. Name the exact organization, project, endpoint, model, and feature. Record whether zero data retention is merely available, approved, configured, or verified in the environment. Evidence means a current configuration record, an accountable owner, and a date. Decision rule. If the team can show only a vendor web page, the system is not verified. Second, the path receipt. Draw the data from the user to the model and back to the final destination. Include the browser, client, gateway, queue, storage, logging, observability, and output systems. Do not draw a vendor logo with 3 arrows pointed toward reassurance. That is not architecture. That is a motivational poster. Decision rule. If one hop is described as the platform, open the box. Third, the compatibility receipt. Check every endpoint and tool against the current data control table. Record incompatible features, stateful behavior, caching, background processing, file handling, search, code execution, and external services. Decision rule. If the workflow depends on an incompatible feature, do not keep the 0 label and hope nobody opens the settings. Fourth, the external service receipt. List every connector, MCP server, search service, data source, and destination outside the model request. For each one, name the owner, purpose, content sent, retention rule, deletion path, and contract boundary. Decision rule. The provider's 0 data retention commitment does not automatically travel with data sent to a third party. Fifth, the exception receipt. Record every legal, safety, security, operational, and support exception. Separate the content retained from the signal retained. Separate automated access from human access. Separate a current control from a preview or planned feature. Decision rule. An exception hidden in a footnote is still part of the architecture. Sixth, the validation and disposition receipt. Test the effective configuration. Send synthetic data. Inspect the logs. Inspect the trace. Inspect the storage objects. Inspect the downstream record. Disable the workflow. Delete what should be deletable. Then verify the disposition instead of trusting the button. Decision rule. If the team cannot reproduce the evidence, the claim is not ready for production. Notice what this receipt does not do. It does not declare a platform compliant. It does not decide a legal basis. It does not resolve records obligations, sector rules, contract terms, or every jurisdiction's requirements. 0 data retention is not automatically a Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act answer, a public records answer, a discovery answer, or a complete privacy assessment. Those questions depend on the actual facts, roles, data, configuration, agreements, and applicable law. This is operational guidance, not legal advice. What the receipt does is prevent a preventable category error. It stops a precise provider promise from becoming an imprecise organizational claim. That is a real improvement. Here is the 45-minute action block. Pick one AI workflow that your team currently describes as 0 retention, private, temporary, or not stored. Use a real workflow, but test it with synthetic data. For the first 10 minutes, write the exact claim. 0 what? At which component? For which project and endpoint? Under which configuration? With which exceptions? For the next 15 minutes, draw the complete path. User, client, gateway, provider, tool, output, logs, backups. Delete path. For the next 10 minutes, compare every component with the current documentation and agreement. Mark each one verified, unknown, incompatible, or exception. For the final 10 minutes, run one synthetic request and collect the evidence. If the evidence matches the claim, approve the language with a date and owner. If it does not, fix the configuration or narrow the claim. Do not widen the adjective. Fix the map. The most useful sentence in this episode is not that zero data retention is meaningless. It is not meaningless. OpenAI's announcement describes a serious attempt to preserve a privacy commitment while improving safety monitoring across interactions. That deserves careful attention. The useful sentence is this: a provider boundary is not a system boundary. Episode 41 asked what the AI could see. Episode 42 asks what remained after the system saw it. Next comes the proof. Can the organization show that the effective path matches the language people were given? Ask 0 where. Ask 0 what. Ask 0 for whom. Ask 0 until when. And ask 0 proved how. That is the retention boundary check. Thanks for listening to AI Change Desk. I am Michael. Take care of the people first, then fix the map. This is AI Change Desk. See you next time.